15 black celebrities whose wives shocked the public.
Love making people laugh.
They built empires, sold out arenas, and looked untouchable to the world. But behind the wealth and the red carpets were marriages rotting from the inside, betrayal, secret affairs, police calls, divorce wars, and heartbreak that fame could not hide. Tonight we uncover the black celebrities who chose love and walked straight into scandal. Subscribe to Black Legends Revealed, because these stories only get darker from here. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye sang like a man who understood the most fragile corners of the human heart. His voice could ache, seduce, confess, and comfort in the same breath, which is why his record still feels so intimate decades later. To the public, he was the soul of Motown, a man of depth, longing, and emotional truth. Behind that image, his marriage to Anna Gordy became one of the deepest strains of his life. When Marvin married Anna in 1963, he was not only choosing a wife, he was stepping directly into the inner circle of Motown power. Anna was Berry Gordy's sister, nearly 17 years older, well-connected and far more secure inside that world than Marvin ever was. What may have begun as love and protection gradually became something heavier. The marriage carried an imbalance from the start, and once resentment entered the room, peace became harder to find. The pain grew sharper because so much of their home life was built on silence. Marvin and Anna raised a son the world believed was theirs, only for it to later emerge that he had actually been fathered by Anna's niece. That revelation damaged what little trust remained. The humiliation did not stay contained inside the marriage. It fed the instability already growing in Marvin's life, widening the cracks around depression, addiction, and emotional collapse. How does a man sing so honestly about love while living inside a home where honesty no longer exists? By the time their divorce was finalized in 1977, the damage had turned financial as well as emotional. Anna received royalties from Marvin's next album, and from that bitterness came "Here, My Dear," one of the rawest breakup records ever made. It was more than music. It was the sound of a wounded man turning private wreckage into art. Marvin's voice remained beautiful. The life behind it was falling apart. Gary Coleman. By the time Gary Coleman married Shannon Price, his life already carried the weight of years spent being used, misunderstood, and watched. America still remembered the child star with the bright face and unforgettable timing. But the man behind that image was older, exhausted, and still searching for steadiness. Shannon entered at a moment when he seemed to need calm. Instead, the relationship became one of the most troubling chapters of his life. They married in 2007, and almost immediately the union felt unstable. The split came fast, yet the bond never truly ended. They continued living in the same space, arguing in public, exposing their private misery on television, and giving the impression of two people who no longer trusted each other. Gary did not look like a husband at peace. He looked like a man living inside confusion. What would you do if the person closest to you kept turning your pain into a spectacle? That question sits at the center of why this story lingers. There were reports of verbal cruelty, physical confrontations, and a restraining order. By the end, the relationship had become less about companionship and more about damage. When Gary suffered the fall that led to his death in 2010, the arguments did not stop. Public outrage erupted over Shannon's role in his final hours, the decision to remove life support, and the attempt to claim part of his estate afterward. What stays with people is not just that Gary Coleman died young. It is the sorrow of watching a man who had already lost so much spend his last years in a home that did not seem to offer tenderness, safety, or rest. Some marriages collapse quietly. His collapsed in full view, leaving behind grief, suspicion, and a final chapter that still feels unbearably cold. Lionel Richie. Lionel Richie did not choose a marriage that failed quietly. He chose one that would eventually split open in full public view, leaving behind not only heartbreak, but humiliation. He married Brenda Harvey in 1975, long before the scandal, long before the headlines, long before the country would see their private collapse turned into a spectacle. Together they later adopted Nicole Richie, And for years, the marriage carried the image of stability, college roots, family life, and a husband whose voice seemed to promise tenderness. But the distance inside that home was growing long before the world saw the damage. Richie has since said the marriage had already been under strain for years as fame altered the rhythm of their lives. The break became unforgettable in June 1988. The Los Angeles Times reported that Brenda Harvey Richie was arrested after allegedly finding Lionel with Diane Alexander in Alexander's Beverly Hills apartment. Police booked her on suspicion of corporal injury to a spouse resisting arrest, trespassing, vandalism, battery, and disturbing the peace. Years later, Lionel revisited that night in his memoir and called it the scandal of my century. That phrase matters because it captures the scale of the collapse. Their marriage was no longer falling apart behind a closed door. It had become a national scene of betrayal, rage, police involvement, and irreversible exposure. How do you rebuild a marriage once shame becomes part of its public identity? Brenda was not simply a passing name in Lionel's history. She was the woman he built a household with, the woman beside him before the chaos arrived, and the woman whose pain became inseparable from his own choices. By the time their divorce was finalized in 1993, the union had become one of the defining scandals attached to his name. What lingers is not only the affair or the arrest or the headlines, it is the feeling of a marriage that lasted for years, then cracked so violently that even Lionel himself would spend decades remembering the sound it made. Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali's first marriage carried a fracture inside it almost from the moment it began. He married Sanjay Roy in 1964, at the very point when his life was changing faster than any ordinary relationship could easily survive. He was no longer just a young champion with charm and speed. He was moving into a new religious identity, a new discipline, and a new public role that asked far more of him than fame alone. Sanjay entered that moment as his wife, but she did not enter it as someone ready to disappear inside his transformation. Biography notes that the marriage lasted only a little over a year, ending after she refused to conform to the Nation of Islam's standards for dress and conduct. That difference sounds simple when reduced to headlines. In reality, it cut into the daily fabric of marriage. A detailed Guardian account based on contemporary reporting and court records shows how intimate the conflict became. When Ali sought an annulment in June 1965, the case itself turned her appearance into evidence. The dresses, the lipstick, the makeup, the refusal to follow the modesty code expected around him. Sanjay said she had tried to understand his faith, but she could not surrender the parts of herself that made her feel recognizable in her own skin. What happens to love when one person calls it commitment, and the other feels herself slowly being erased? That tension gives the marriage its sadness. Neither of them entered it empty. He wanted loyalty to the life he believed he had been called into. She wanted room to remain herself inside the marriage. Those two desires kept colliding until even ordinary closeness became difficult. By the time the court ordered support and legal costs, the union already looked less like a home than a struggle over identity itself. What Ali chose was not simply the wrong woman. He chose marriage at a moment when his need for control, faith image, and personal reinvention had become too large for tenderness to live beside it. James Brown. James Brown's marriage to Adrienne Rodriguez did not unravel in whispers. It moved from attraction into volatility, then from volatility into police reports, drugs dropped charges, and public fear. They married in 1984, and before long the relationship had become inseparable from the most unstable chapter of Brown's personal life. Biography records Brown's repeated domestic violence arrests over the years, while later reporting and retrospective accounts tie some of the most troubling episodes of that period directly to his marriage with Adrienne. By 1987 and 1988, the damage was impossible to hide. The Guardian's review of Brown's life says Adrienne filed for divorce after claiming he struck her with an iron pipe and fired shots at her car. A 1995 Tampa Bay Times archive also notes that she had earlier accused him of beating her and shooting into a car while she was inside. Then the story twisted further 2 days after Brown was arrested on drug, weapons, and assault charges. In May 1988, The Los Angeles Times reported that Adrienne herself was arrested and charged with PCP possession. This was no ordinary celebrity breakup circling the tabloids. It was a marriage where chaos had stopped visiting and started living in the house. How do you stay in a marriage once every fight begins to sound like a police report waiting to happen? That question hangs over this story because neither peace nor stability ever seems to have had much room inside it. Women's and News reported that Brown faced spouse abuse charges at least 3 times during their 10-year marriage, though those cases were later dropped. In 1995, Adrienne was again at the center of a domestic violence accusation, and the charges were dropped only after she died in January 1996, following complications from cosmetic surgery. What remains is a picture of a man who did not choose calm, refuge, or repair. He chose a marriage that fed the most dangerous parts of his life until both people inside it were being dragged toward the edge. Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman did not choose a marriage that failed slowly. He chose one that detonated almost as soon as it began. On November 14, 1998, Rodman and Carmen Electra were married in Las Vegas. 9 days later, he filed for an annulment, saying he had been of unsound mind when he took the vows. The Chicago Sun-Times later summarized the filing in blunt terms. Rodman claimed he was drunk, and his lawyer framed the marriage as something entered in a reckless fog, rather than clear judgment. A union that fragile does not begin with trust. It begins with impulse confusion and the illusion that intensity can substitute for foundation. They briefly tried to keep going, but the instability did not ease. On December 8, 1998, CBS News reported that Rodman and Electra were both arrested in Miami Beach after police responded to a fight at a hotel following a night out at clubs. Both were charged with simple battery. Nearly a year later, after they had already divorced, the chaos returned again. Entertainment Weekly, citing the Associated Press, reported that the former couple were arrested once more in Miami Beach after another loud hotel altercation in November 1999. When a relationship keeps circling back to police handcuffs and broken control, the problem is no longer bad timing. It is the fact that neither person seems able to create safety with the other. What kind of marriage survives when the first instinct is always explosion instead of shelter? By April 1999. The marriage was over. People have since described it simply as a union that ended 6 months later, but the dates alone tell the real story. Wedding annulment, filing arrest divorce, then yet another arrest after the split. What Rodman chose was not steadiness, loyalty, or repair. He chose a woman who matched the same wild, combustible energy he was already drowning in. The result was not love made stronger by chaos. It was a short, public collapse that never found enough peace to become a home. Ray Charles. Ray Charles did not marry glamour. He married what looked like refuge. In 1955, he wed Della Beatrice Robinson, known as Bea, after meeting her the year before in Texas. She was not part of the nightclub swirl, not one of the women already circling his career, not a person the public would have linked to chaos. For a man moving deeper into fame, that kind of wife must have seemed like safety. They built a family and stayed together for 22 years, but the shape of the marriage and the reality inside it were never the same thing. Ray would later acknowledge that his heroin addiction took a toll on Bea, and accounts of their marriage consistently point to the same slow poison drugs, absences, extramarital relationships, and a temperament that made home feel less like rest than another place to endure pressure. The deepest trouble was not one dramatic betrayal. It was repetition. While Bea was raising their 3 sons, Ray was living a second life that kept breaking into the first. During the marriage, he had long affairs and fathered children with other women, including women connected to his professional world. The Washington Post later noted that many of Ray's children were born outside his marriage to Della. That detail changes the emotional scale of the story. A wife can survive one wound and still hope the marriage might steady itself. It is much harder to survive a pattern that keeps proving the vows were never strong enough to govern the man who made them. How long can a marriage remain a shelter when the man inside it keeps bringing other lives through the door? By the time B filed for divorce in 1977, the sadness in this story had become unmistakable. Ray had not chosen a woman who wrecked him. He had chosen a marriage he was not willing to protect. What failed him was not the promise of home, but his inability to live like home was sacred. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke's marriage to Barbara Campbell carried more strain than the public ever saw. They married in Chicago in 1958, with Sam's father performing the ceremony. And for a time, the relationship seemed to offer him something rare, a home untouched by the noise of fame. They had children together, and on the outside it looked like the kind of family life a rising star could return to when the crowds were gone. But the foundation was already under pressure. Major biographical accounts note that Cooke fathered several children outside the marriage, which means Barbara was not living beside one passing mistake. She was living with repeated betrayal. Then grief entered the house and changed its atmosphere completely. In 1963, their young son Vincent drowned in the family swimming pool. The loss was devastating, and sources looking back on Cooke's life still treat it as one of the defining wounds of his final years. A marriage already weakened by secrecy now had to carry unbearable sorrow as well. Love can absorb a great deal, but grief has a way of exposing every crack that was already there. What survives in a marriage after betrayal and mourning begin living under the same roof. Sam was killed on December 11, 1964, at only 33. The official ruling called it justifiable homicide, though the circumstances have been debated for decades. Then came the decision that turned private pain into lasting scandal. Barbara married Bobby Womack in March 1965, roughly 3 months after Cooke's death. That move outraged the Cooke family and much of the wider music world. Cleveland's Encyclopedia and Black Past both note how fiercely the marriage was condemned and how much damage it did to Womack's standing. What makes this story so painful is not just that Sam chose the wrong wife. It is that the marriage seemed unable to protect anything once pressure arrived. Not trust, not grief, not memory, not even his legacy after he was gone. His voice remained immortal. The life attached to it broke apart in full view. Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson did not marry a stranger to his world. He married Claudette Rogers in 1959, one of the women already standing beside him inside the Miracles, which meant the relationship began with shared history, shared music, and the illusion that closeness on stage could guarantee closeness at home. It lasted 27 years, long enough to look permanent from the outside. The inside told a different story. In later interviews, Smokey admitted that he had multiple affairs during the marriage, including a year-long relationship with Diana Ross. Biographical summaries also note that he fathered a son with another woman in 1984, while still married to Claudette, and that the revelation helped push the marriage to its end in 1986. What makes this marriage fit the title is not that it ended. Plenty of long marriages end. What makes it linger is how badly the damage refused to stay in the past. Claudette was not a brief chapter who disappeared after the divorce papers were signed. She remained tied to the deepest parts of his life, the songs, the catalog, the money, the years that built Motown itself. In August 1987, UPI reported that Claudette was seeking roughly $20,000 to $25,000 a month in support, turning the separation into a fresh legal battle almost immediately after the split. What kind of marriage keeps arguing? Even after the love is gone, the bitterness resurfaced decades later. In 2014, Smokey sued Claudette over whether she could claim an interest in song copyrights he was trying to recapture under federal law. Billboard and The Hollywood Reporter both covered the fight, which centered on whether his ex-wife could reach back into the Motown catalog through California community property claims. That tells you how little of the marriage had truly been buried. It did not end cleanly. It kept following him through the work that made him immortal. What Smokey chose was not simply the wrong partner. He chose a bond so tightly fused to art money and memory that even divorce could not cut it loose. Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy did not marry Nicole Mitchell in a moment of confusion or impulse. He chose her after years together, after meeting her in 1988, after building a real family, and after deciding she was the woman he wanted at the center of his life. They married in 1993 and went on to have 5 children together. That history matters because it means the collapse was not the failure of a short romance. It was the fracture of a home that had been built slowly publicly and with enough time behind it to look permanent. People's timeline of Murphy's relationships notes the basic facts cleanly. They met in 1988, married in 1993, and by 2005, Nicole filed for divorce after 12 years of marriage. What gives the story weight is the length of the life they made before it broke. 5 children, more than a decade as husband and wife. The image of stability was not invented out of thin air. It existed because there really was something there to lose. When Nicole filed in August 2005, citing irreconcilable differences in seeking joint custody and spousal support, the filing itself sounded formal, almost cold. But long marriages do not fall apart in legal language. They fall apart in accumulated silence, unmet expectations, and years of distance that eventually become impossible to disguise. Contemporary reporting from the time noted the filing and the fact that the children ranged from very young to teenagers, which only sharpens the sense of what was being torn open. How many years can a man call something home once the family inside it no longer feels held together? Murphy responded with a brief statement saying that children's welfare was the first priority. It was dignified but also telling. By then, the marriage had moved beyond repair and into management of the damage. What lingers is not a screaming public scandal like some of the other stories on this list. It is something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. A marriage that lasted long enough to feel solid, then gave way under pressures neither fame nor money could keep from reaching the front door. Miles Davis. Miles Davis did not marry a woman who needed his fame. He married a woman whose dignity, discipline, and poise seemed almost strong enough to steady the chaos in him. His relationship with Cicely Tyson stretched across more than 2 decades of breaking apart and pulling back together before they finally married in 1981. By then, the bond already carried history, longing, and damage. The Los Angeles Times described their connection as a decades-long romance that was turbulent by both of their own accounts, while People noted that Tyson later wrote about repeated cycles of reunion, separation, joy, and hurt. What makes this marriage feel tragic is that Tyson was not a passing figure in his life. She was the woman he kept returning to when other parts of him were collapsing. In her memoir, she recalled that he was unfaithful. In interviews tied to that memoir, she still called him the love of her life. That contradiction tells you how deep the attachment ran. Love was there, but so were wounds that never stopped reopening. Miles, for his part, later admitted in his autobiography to drug addiction and violent episodes with women, and the Los Angeles Times obituary on his death described the marriage to Tyson as ending in a bitter divorce. What kind of marriage can survive when tenderness keeps sharing a room with betrayal, fear, and relapse? By the time the union broke for good in the late 1980s, the sadness was larger than scandal. Tyson had not entered his life to use him or outshine him. She entered it believing she could love a man whose gifts were extraordinary and whose self-destruction was just as real. He chose a wife who represented grace, stability, and order, yet the life he brought into the marriage kept pulling against all three. What remains is not the image of a glamorous couple. It is the image of a man reaching for peace through the person he loved most, and still failing to protect either her or the home they tried to build. Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron chose Barbara Lucas before the world knew what his name would come to mean. They met in Jacksonville in 1953, married that same year, and built a family that eventually included 5 children. On the surface, it was the kind of early marriage people often imagine, as solid, young love, shared beginnings, a home formed before the legend hardened around the man. But marriages made before history arrives do not always survive what history demands. The Society for American Baseball Research says the relationship had been in trouble since 1966, and by February 1971, the separation had become a legal divorce. That timing gives the story its ache. Aaron's home was breaking apart, just as the pressure around him was becoming almost unbearable. He was moving toward Babe Ruth's record, and America was not simply watching. It was threatening him. One biographical reference notes that during the early 1970s, even while dealing with the stress of the divorce, Aaron was receiving an estimated 3,000 letters a day, including hate mail so serious that security had to be increased and the FBI became involved. A marriage that might once have offered shelter was already gone by then. He was carrying history on his back without the private stability people like to imagine great men have waiting for them at home. What does a man lean on when the house is falling apart at the very moment the whole country is leaning on him? No public spectacle ever defined this split. No sensational arrest, no tabloid frenzy, no courtroom theater. The sadness is quieter than that. Aaron did not choose a wife who became a national scandal. He chose a marriage that could not hold through the long years it took to become Hank Aaron. By the time he was nearing the most scrutinized achievement of his life, the family structure he had built in youth was already part of the past. What remains is not one explosive incident, but the image of a man being asked to make history while carrying private loss in complete public view. Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones chose Peggy Lipton at a moment when family must have looked like the one thing his life still needed. They met in 1969, reunited after his second marriage ended, and Lipton later said he was looking for family, while she felt she could offer exactly that. They married in September 1974, after the birth of their first daughter, Kidada, and later had Rashida. Lipton stepped back from acting for years to raise their children, while Quincy kept moving through a career that never really slowed down. From the outside, it looked elegant talent, beauty daughters, a house full of culture, and the kind of marriage people imagine can survive anything if the love is real enough. What wore the marriage down was not one lurid scandal. It was the long strain of trying to build intimacy around a man whose world kept expanding faster than domestic life could hold it. PBS's American Masters notes that Quincy suffered an emotional breakdown in 1986, and by 1989 the marriage had ended. The divorce was finalized in 1990. Lipton later spoke about how fame had driven her inward and how insulated she had become during those years. The picture that emerges is not of a glamorous collapse, but of a home slowly losing air. She had chosen family. He had chosen family too, but he never stopped belonging to a much larger machine. How do you stay married to a man the whole world is always borrowing from you? The sadness in Quincy's story comes from how sincere the hope seems to have been at the start. Lipton was not a passing romance. She became the mother of two of his daughters and the center of what may have been his most recognizable version of home. Yet the marriage could not survive the distance built by work pressure and the emotional cost of a life lived too publicly. Even after the divorce, Quincy still called Peggy my beloved when she died in 2019. That kind of tenderness makes the ending feel even sadder. He did not choose a woman who meant nothing. He chose a marriage that could not protect what both of them wanted most. Al Green. Al Green married Shirley Kiles in June 1977, and from the outside the union seemed to promise exactly what his life appeared to need. Faith order, a shared church world, and a woman who already knew the discipline surrounding his ministry. Shirley had worked with him as a backing vocalist and at his church, so this was not a glamorous collision between strangers. It was a marriage built inside closeness, trust, and the belief that shared spiritual ground could hold two people steady. They went on to have 3 daughters together. Yet almost as soon as the marriage began, the private reality turned violent. Shirley first filed for divorce in 1978, then again in 1981, alleging repeated domestic abuse throughout the relationship. What makes this story so tragic is how quickly the promise of refuge turned into fear. In Shirley's later account to the Washington Post, she said he slapped her repeatedly just days into the marriage, then beat her with an acoustic guitar during an argument about sex. She described a pattern of pushing, shoving threats, and repeated assaults that continued through pregnancies, separations, and reconciliations. Under oath in 1982, Al Green admitted that he had struck her even as the marriage kept collapsing and restarting. The wedding was not the beginning of peace. It was the beginning of a cycle neither of them could stop. What kind of marriage leaves a woman hoping each apology will be the last time she has to survive the same man again? By the time the divorce was finalized in February 1983, the damage had already outgrown the marriage itself. Green agreed to pay $432,800 in alimony and child support, and Shirley would later say that the story of Nicole Brown Simpson pushed her to speak publicly about what she had endured. Nothing about this ending feels romantic, misunderstood, or merely turbulent. Al Green chose a marriage that should have been a sanctuary, then turned it into a place his wife had to escape in order to live. O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson married Nicole Brown in 1985 after beginning a relationship with her years earlier when she was still a teenager and he was already one of the most recognizable men in America. By the time they became husband and wife, he had fame, money, television charm, and the kind of public image that can make private danger easier to hide. They had 2 children, Sydney and Justin, and for a while the marriage looked polished from the outside. Inside, it was far darker. Britannica says the relationship was turbulent and at times violent, and biography notes that by the time Nicole filed for divorce in 1992, the marriage had already been marked by abuse. The pain did not stop when the marriage ended. Prosecutors later argued that the violence continued after the divorce, and Britannica's trial summary says they used that history of domestic abuse as a motive in court. Nicole's own fear had become part of the public record long before her death. Accounts tied to the case describe repeated police calls, stalking threats, and the sense that separation had not brought real freedom. That is where the tragedy in this story deepens. The marriage did not collapse and stay in the past. It kept reaching forward, dragging fear with it. What kind of marriage still has the power to terrify after the vows are over? On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were found murdered outside her Brentwood home. O.J. Simpson was acquitted in the criminal trial, but Britannica notes that in the 1997 civil case, he was found liable for the deaths and ordered to pay $33.5 million in damages. That judgment, together with a history of abuse presented in court, turned the marriage into one of the most infamous and devastating celebrity scandals in American history. The sadness here is almost unbearable. He chose a marriage that should have become a family. Instead, it became a public record of obsession, fear, collapse, and irreversible loss. Some of these marriages ended in divorce. Others ended in scandal, shame, or wounds that never truly closed. Looking back, the real question is not whether these men were famous enough to survive the damage, but whether they ever truly saw the warning signs before it was too late. Were these women always the wrong choice? Or did fame, ego, secrecy, and broken trust destroy what love once promised? That debate is far from over. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed for more powerful stories where love, legacy, and scandal collide in ways history never forgets.